Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at chapter 37 of book 5 from Caesar's de Bello Gallico. So you remember, if you've been following this series, this is following Ambiorix's revolt. We're in the middle basically of the Gallic Wars, really centered on 54 BCE, and we're looking at this region in sort of northeast Belgium, close to the German border, and this particular fort. So you want to remember, Caesar coming back from Britain, he's put his men into the forts, and this particular one has been ambushed by Ambiorix. The two men leading it are Sabinus and Cotta, and up until this point, we've seen how he basically led them into a trap. Now, at this point of the narrative in chapter 37, we've already seen they're in the middle of the trap. The Romans are holding their own, but not doing particularly well because, again, they've been surrounded. And we've seen the individual actions of Sabinus and Cotta, right? So Cotta is wounded, right? He's been hit by a javelin in the leg, shot in the face, right? He's really having a tough time, but he's still kind of leading his men. Sabinus is not wounded, but again, he's about to be tricked because he's got a messenger come to him from Ambiorix saying, hey, why don't we have a peace talk, right? So now in chapter 37, we're going to see what happens, where we have Sabinus trying to make peace with Ambiorix. And based on everything you've read so far, you can already guess this is not going to go well. So that's where we are, kind of in the heat of the moment with this ambush. So before we dive into the translation, like I always tell you, whenever we do anything translating Latin, the first thing you want to do is get the vocab down. So De Bello Gallico is very famous, of course, being part of the AP curriculum. You can find Quizlets really anywhere, right, just to get the vocab. So in other words, you can find vocab lists anywhere is what I mean. A lot of them are on Quizlet. So if you just do a quick search, you should be able to find all the words that you need, but just make sure that you get them down. If you don't have a list, I would say pre-read, right? Just look through chapter 37. Any words you don't know from sight, just look them up and make a list for yourself. But it's really hard to understand what's going on if you don't have the vocab. So that should always be step one. The other thing you should do is read it aloud, right? I'll read it to you here. But like I always say, my pronunciation rather is nothing fantastic. So if you're an AP student, I would try to find someone in class, just someone you could read to, work on your speaking, your pronunciation. They can read the story back to you. And that way you're working on your listening skills. These are always great things you never want to shut off. Rather, whenever you're learning a language, you don't want to just read it in your head and translate in your head. Bring it to life. You never know, that might be something that unlocks it for you, just helps you understand it better. So again, always read it. The last thing I'd say is, when it comes time for actually translating, your best bet is going to be the read and reread method. So I've told you this before, but particularly if you are an AP student, this curriculum is very long. I know at me anyway, I spread it out across 2 years. I know other teachers who do as well. It's a lot to pack into a year, particularly if you're trying to prep for a test and really hoping to do well on it. It can be a lot. So I know time is something that's really working against you, but I still would say that if you do the read and reread method, where you read through it once, write down any problem areas you have, look them up, right, and then go back and repeat that process over and over again, it'll lock it into your long-term memory. And part of the thing that's hard with the AP is trying to cram so much information over a year, maybe longer than a year, for one test. It's just really hard to do. So try to make the time. It's the best way to put it in your long-term memory and actually make sure that you've got it. And the idea is that if you're able to read through this chapter without needing any help or writing anything down, that's how you know you're ready to move on, and you probably will be ready for the test. Okay, so if you haven't done that, pause the video here, go work on your own. But for the rest of the video, I'll walk you through it, and we'll see what we can come up with to help you translate. Okay, as long as your translation is somewhere in the region of mine, you'll be fine. It doesn't have to be perfect, but again, as long as you understand it, you're okay. So here we go. The chapter starts like this. You have Sabinus, quos in praesentia tribunos militum circum se habebat, et primorum ordinum centuriones se sequi iubet, et cum propius ambiorigem arcesisset, iussus arma abicere imperatum facit, suisque ut idem faciant imperat. Okay, so this is a longer sentence, but we can kind of unpack it here. So it's focusing on Sabinus, because remember, he's the one who's about to do something really stupid and walk into another trap from Ambiorix, okay? But to understand this, you really have to look a little bit past. So quos is really going with the whole phrase up until where it says you bet. So the main idea that you actually want to go to make sense of it is you bet. Otherwise, it won't really make sense. So you're saying Sabinus orders, right? Now you can kind of see where this all goes. He orders the tribunes, the tribunos, right? The tribunes whom, in the present, meaning in the present moment, and again, it's the tribunos militum, so the tribunes of the soldiers, rather. He orders the tribunes of the soldiers whom, in the present moment, right, in the heat of the battle, he had around him, circum se habebat, right? So he happened to have people around him, tribunes. That's who he orders. It kind of means that these might not have been the people he necessarily wanted wanted, but it's just whoever happened to be standing by him in the moment, that's who he orders. So he orders them and primorum ordinum centuriones, and the centurions of the first rank that he had around him is kind of the idea. So this group of people from quos down to centuriones, that's who he's ordering. So it's the tribunes, the centurions. He orders them, se sequi, to follow him. Okay, so this is what he does. He grabs all the leaders around him, all the commanders. He says, follow me. Okay, then when propius ambiorigem arcesisset, when he had approached, is pluperfect. So when he had approached more closely Ambiorix, or had approached Ambiorix more closely, meaning gotten closer to him, having been ordered, usus, right, having been ordered to arma abicere, to throw down his weapons. So again, they tell him, don't come near Ambiorix armed. So having been ordered to throw down his weapons, he does the thing commanded. So imperatum facit. So he actually does this, which is wild, right? A bananas move from Sabinus. He actually disarms himself and his men in front of an enemy. Not really great, right? And you can kind of tell by the way Caesar writes this. It's almost like he's shocked too. Like, I can't believe this idiot got rid of his weapons in front of the enemy, but that's what it is. So imperatum facit, he does the thing, commanded. And not only that, and, right, he orders or commands, imperat, right, he commands his own men, right, it takes a dative suisque, so he orders his own men that they might do the same, ut idem faciat, or you could say he ordered them to do the same. So not only is he kind of dumb enough to throw down his own weapons, but he orders all these leaders that he brought with him. And remember, these aren't just sort of common soldiers, these are the commanders. So when they're about to die, which is what you can predict is about to happen, this is not great for the Roman army, right? He has a bunch of commanders with him. They just threw down their weapons in the face of an enemy. This is not a good idea, right? This is not good for them. Then we continue in the next line. You have interim, right? Dum de conditionibus inter se agunt longiorque consulto ab ambiorige instituitor sermo paulatim circumventus interficitur. Okay, so meanwhile, while inter se, among themselves, they talk, agunt, right? So while they talk amongst themselves, de conditionibus, about the conditions, and that can be implied to mean like the conditions of surrender. Remember, that's what they're doing there, right? So Sabinus is basically trying to make a peace treaty, and they're setting up how this is going to happen. So it literally says when they talk about the conditions. Again, it's talking about conditions of surrender. So while this is happening, you have a sermo, right? A speech is made, instituitor, right? It is made by Ambiorix. So he starts talking, right? And it's a longer speech, right? Longior. It's deliberately longer. So in other words, he starts making a very much longer than normal conversation, right? A sermo, a speech. It means Ambiorix is dragging this out, right? So he's making it longer than it needs to be. And gradually, palatum, right? Gradually surrounded circumventus. So meaning as Ambiorix is talking, his men are slowly surrounding this Roman group and kind of closing in on him. And while he's distracting with this peace talk, interficitur, he is killed, right? So Sabinus and all his men get killed, which is exactly what you figured was going to happen, right? Ambiorix, this is his last trick. He's tricked Sabinus over and over again. And at this point, you can't believe he's dumb enough to actually think this would work, but he gives it a shot. Ambiorix pretends that he's going to listen, and they kill him. Okay? So this is the death of Sabinus, and now he's done. Okay? Then you have Tumveros suo more victoriam conclamant, atque ululatum tollunt impetuque. So let's try that again. Impetuque, there we go, in nostros facto ordines perturba. Okay, so then, truly, by their own custom, right, suo more, meaning the custom of the Gauls and Ambiorix's men, they conclamant, they shout out, and they shout victoria, victory, right? So they start shouting victory because they've killed the Roman commander, right? They think it's over, and they raise ululatum, like a howling, right? Is kind of one way to do it. This great noise, right? So they raise up this commotion. because they're thinking that the battle's over. This right, this yelling, this howling, whatever it might be, and they keep shouting victory because they've killed him. And with an attack, right, impetu, so impetuque, in nostros, on our men, right, they disturb the ordines, right. So you can do impetu and facto is the ablative absolute there. So with an attack having been made on our men, they perturbant, they disturb or disrupt the ordines, the battle lines. So the scene you want to understand happening here is after they kill Sabinus, this energizes all of Ambiorix's men because they're thinking the commander's dead, or at least one of them. It rallies the Gauls, they charge, and they kind of crash through the Roman battle line, which up until this point had been holding its own. Remember, that's what Caesar's telling us. Now it's been disturbed, right? Meaning it's been broken apart. So it's not going well for the Romans anymore. Then you have ibi Lucius Cotta pugnans interficitur cum maxima parte militum. And this is kind of the sad line, because now we see what happened to Cotta, who was still alive, even though he was badly wounded. So you have there, right, as the Gauls come crashing through, Lucius Cotta pugnans, fighting, right? It's a present participle. So in the moment he's fighting, he's killed. So he dies fighting, pugnans interficitur. And he dies cum maxima parte militum, with the greatest part of the soldiers, or with a great part of the soldiers. So basically, it's not only that he dies, but here all the Romans basically meet their end, right? So Cotta's dead, Sabinus is dead, and the bigger part of the Romans are now dead. All right, so this is the end of the battle. Then we continue on. You have reliqui se in castra recipiunt unde erant egressi ex quibus Lucius Petrosidius Aquilifer rather, cum magna multitudine hostium premeretor aquilam intravallam proiecit. Okay, so reliqui is the rest, the remaining. So this is sort of like the remaining men, or the remaining Romans, is the survivors who are still alive. They se recipiunt, they retreat. Remember, it literally means like bring themselves back. They retreat in castra, into the camp. So they go running back into the camp, unde erat egressi, from where they had departed, right, where they had egressed or left, right? You have the pluperfect deponent there, it's egredior. So they go all the way back to the camp, they're running, they're being chased by the Gauls, okay? Then you have from these, right, ex quibus, so from these men, and we get a particular name here, right? Another interesting anecdote where Caesar is narrowing in on one kind of random soldier, but it's Lucius Petrosidius, right? And he's the Aquilifer, he's the eagle bearer. So he's not a random soldier, that's not what I mean. He's an important soldier, even though he might be kind of random for the story, but he's the Aquilifer, right? We've seen the eagle bearer before in Caesar's narrative. If you remember book 4 in Britain, the eagle bearer plays a key role. So here, the Aquilifer, who's still alive, right? He premeretor, he was pressed, or you might even say cum, since he was pressed by the magna multitudine hostium, by a great multitude of enemies, meaning they're kind of enclosing all around him. So he's running back to the camp and he's getting attacked by all these enemies. So he does something really heroic. He proiecit, he threw the aquilam, the eagle, that's the legionary standard. He threw it intrawallum, inside the wall. So you have this great scene where this specific man, or specific soldier, the Aquilifer, is running to the camp. He knows he's not going to make it. He's being pressed on all sides. He can't get in. So instead of letting the enemy take the eagle, which would be a huge dishonor, he very bravely throws it into the wall to protect it for the rest of the men who are in there. And then we finish the line and see what happens. You have ipse procastris fortissime pugnans occiditur. So he himself is killed, fortissime pugnans, fighting most bravely, procastris, before the camp. So not only does he know he's about to die, but he saves the eagle, and then he turns around and he dies fighting. So here's another sort of brave Roman that's getting zeroed in on by Caesar, and we'll talk about at the end why he's doing this. But it's another great sort of anecdote, or short little part of the battle that he decides to focus on, the Aquilifer, right, saving the eagle. Then we continue on. You have Eli. Aegre ad noctem appugnationem sustinent. Noctu ad unum omnes desperata salute se ipsi interficiunt. Right, and here's a really sad part of the story, but we see kind of what happens. So Ili is they, right, the remaining ones. So scarcely sustained the appugnationem, the siege through the night, ad noctem, to the nighttime. So they barely were able to withstand the siege in the fort. Okay. Then you have noctu, at night. Ad unum means like to one. It could mean to a man, right? To each individual man is really what it means. Maybe to the man is a better way to say it. But they've barely sustained this battle, and to a man, all of them, omnes, they themselves, all themselves, omnes ipsi, really, se interficiunt, they killed themselves. And they do this, here's the ablative absolute, desperata salute, with hope, with safety, rather, having been given up, desperata, right? So they have no hope of safety left. They're trapped, they're surrounded, there's only a few of them left. So they decide that rather being captured by the enemy, they decide to commit suicide, right? The sort of death before dishonor mantra of the Roman army. So here's a sad thing too, where some of the men did escape. They tried to go back to the camp thinking that might be all right, and they're just not, right? They're surrounded. But instead of being killed by this massive force around them, they decide to take their own lives. Then you end with this. You have pauci ex proelio lapsi incertis itineribus, rather, per silvas ad titum labienum legatum in hiberna perveniunt atque eum de rebus gestis certiorem faciunt. Okay, so a few, right? And these are not the same men who ran back to the fort, but a few men, lapsi, having slipped away from the battle, ex proelio, right, having slipped out from the battle, and they did this in certis itineribus, by uncertain journeys or uncertain routes or paths, might make sense. Routes is probably the easier way to do this, by uncertain routes. Per silvas, through the woods. Okay, so basically they had run away into unknown land through the woods. Remember, they're not on the path anymore because the road had led them into an ambush. They're just running through the woods with no idea really where they're going. But they perveniunt, they arrived in Hiberna, in the winter quarters, to Titum Labienum, right, to Titus Labienus, the legate, legatum, right? So they arrived to Titus Labienus, the legate, in his winter quarters. Okay, so they actually find a way out, and this is the famous Titus Labienus, who's Caesar's right-hand man. They're able to find him. So a few men, even though they don't necessarily know where they're going, I guess they knew the general direction, they find more Romans. So there's a few who survive. And they eum faciunt, they make him certiorem, more certain, is really the sort of literal translation. We've seen this idiom before, though, from Caesar. It's not so much make him more certain, it means they inform him. That's really what it means. They report to him, de rebus gestis, about the things having been done. Okay, so they show up and they tell him everything that happened. The ambush, Ambiorix, the trickery, Sabinus and Cotta, everything. So when we talk about Book 5 and how Caesar would have known this is really how he would have known. There are some survivors. They make it back and they tell Titus Labienus, right? He would have told Caesar. But again, this is where we've been talking about, as we go through Book 5, how did Caesar know this? If he were to know it, and a lot of this we said is not necessarily the full truth, this is how he would have heard enough to be able to tell us about it, right? So some of the men slip off. So you have this great scene where the Romans are ambushed and a few men run, and they're able to kind of warn the others. The ones who made it back to the fort were able to kind of hold out for a night, but then they realize that the situation is desperate. So basically, Sabinus and Cotta's entire regiment there has been wiped out. And the few that made it back have now kind of warned the rest of the Romans. Okay? So this is the end of Sabinus and Cotta. So some things to think about as you read through. You want to notice how in the middle of the action, Caesar's switching with the historical present, right? So that's a really powerful tool for the audience. So that idea of using the historical present puts you right in the moment. So you see this, if you go back and look at it, it kind of puts you right into the moment, the ambush, all the craziness happening. The other thing that you want to kind of think about is this idea of the crowd of Ambiorix's men. So there's this focus on the crowd, the multitudine, right? This vast amount of Ambiorix's men. But there's also this individual focus on Romans, right? And you want to think about what the effect of this is. So you have the crowd of Gauls and Ambiorix's men. It makes it seem kind of overwhelming. But then he takes time to really talk about like the Aquilifer and different Romans and what Sabinus does and what Cotta does. This is a powerful thing. It makes it more human, is kind of the idea, when he talks about individual Romans. And he's done that before, and we've spoken about it before. The story of the Aquifer, again, another powerful piece of the story. And it's this idea that even in the face of defeat, the soldiers keep on fighting, right? They're not all giving up. So the eagle bearer is a really important part of how, Caesar's showing that his men kept fighting to the death. And he always paints his men in the best light, right? It's not necessarily the commanders. Sabinus is still an idiot, and Caesar lets you know. But he's never going to throw his own soldiers under the bus no matter what, because he needs them. Remember, this is Caesar's army. He always caters to his men because they become loyal to him. So he's not going to write anything bad about him. On the other side, he's actually going to prop them up and highlight people like his Aquifer, right? It's a really powerful message. The fate of the soldiers in the camp, it's another powerful image, right? We spoke about this, but the idea of choosing death over dishonor, that's a trademark of the ideal Roman soldier, right? Caesar, again, is praising his men and putting the blame on Sabinus. And it's really kind of interesting to see the end fate of Sabinus and Cotta. We said it's been set up for chapters, so you shouldn't be surprised. But when you see it, it kind of fits the whole narrative. Cotta goes down fighting. Sabinus is an idiot and gets killed. The Roman men go down fighting. So you can see how Cotta and the soldiers are placed on one side, this idea, again, of death over dishonor. And Sabinus is pretty squarely put on the other side of this guy's an idiot, right? He should have either fought to the death or been with his men, but Caesar's pretty squarely putting the blame on Sabinus for this. As someone who should have known better, right? And not the ideal Roman soldier. So we've gone through this narrative again. You've seen Sabinus and Cotta. Now it's going to switch in book 5, and we're going to talk about other parts of Ambiorix's revolt. But you've kind of gotten the key event, right? This idea of the trickery of Ambiorix and how he takes out a Roman or part of a Roman army that had been encamped. This is how he does it in the end fate of everyone basically dying. And now the Romans are warned and they know what Ambiorix is doing. And we'll continue on the next chapter and see how it goes. If you have any questions at all, put them in the comments below. Anything you might need, I always try to work through the translation a little quickly just for the sake of time, but oftentimes you can hear me stumble. So if I'm not clear about something, just tell me. I'll clear it up for you. Not a big deal. But what you want to do is make sure that you were able to read through it, like I said, start to finish. And as long as your translation was somewhere in the ballpark of mine, you can probably feel pretty comfortable that you're on the right track and you understood what's going on. But otherwise, just put it down below, and I'll help you. Apart from that, keep practicing, keep reading it. And once you hit a point where you're able to read this start to finish and you understand it all, that's how you know you're ready to move on. Good luck.